He never cared for fireworks, not at birthdays, not on New Year's, not even on 4th of July. What Caleb had always believed in was a quieter kind of magic, the kind that happened when someone looked at you and saw your whole soul without needing a spotlight. So when he said yes to Mateo's proposal, it wasn't diamonds he pictured. It was sunlight through stained glass, hands held under old oak beams, and the warmth of people who truly knew him. Caleb Hayes, 26, taught art at a modest public high school in Portland. His students said he made colors feel like emotions. And maybe that was true because Caleb had spent most of his life learning how to blend beauty out of pain. Raised by his grandmother after being disowned at 17, he built his life from sketchbooks and second chances. And though he lived with less, he never let go of a small hope that one day, someone would love him enough to stand with him at the altar he had imagined since the night he was cast out. That altar wasn't made of marble. It sat quietly on the edge of a pine forest, a tiny wooden church that never turned him away. He remembered the first time he walked through its doors, face bruised, heart broken. After his father had told him to never come back, the pastor didn't ask questions. He just opened his arms, and Caleb collapsed into them like a child finally allowed to breathe. Years later, when Mateo got down on one knee during a snowy holiday trip, Caleb said yes through tears, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt real. Mateo had been his constant for 4 years, a confident, stylish interior designer, with a wealthy father and a life so different it felt like a movie. But he never judged Caleb for living simply, or so Caleb thought. They talked about the wedding for months. Caleb didn't want extravagance. He dreamed of a ceremony in that old wooden church. A potluck in the backyard afterward, where guests sat on borrowed benches and drank lemonade out of jars. No tuxedos, no orchestras, no chandeliers, just people who loved them, under a sky that didn't need glitter to be stunning. Mateo listened, or at least nodded. He kissed Caleb's forehead and said, "Whatever makes you happy." Caleb believed him. In quiet moments, Caleb would press swatches of linen to his cheek, imagining how they'd look beside Mateo's smile. He made little sketches of the altar, tried different flower arrangements in watercolors. His students would peek over his shoulder and tease, "Is that the lucky guy?" He'd blush, laugh, but inside he was steady, certain. This was going to be a celebration of love, not wealth. And above all, Caleb wanted that church, not because it was grand, but because it was sacred. That place had seen his worst and never turned him away. It had held his grief, his loneliness, his fragile dreams, and now he wanted it to witness his joy. He didn't know that elsewhere. Different plans were being drawn. He didn't know that someone else had decided a boy like him needed more than a church in the woods, that his love story had been rewritten, quietly, without his hand on the page. But he would, and when that day came, Caleb would have to choose between the dream he held onto and the illusions someone else built for him. Not every fairy tale ends with a castle. Sometimes the bravest thing is walking away from one. Follow Heart Story for more true-to-soul tales of identity, quiet courage, and the love that chooses respect over spectacle. Because sometimes honoring yourself is the most beautiful vow you'll ever make. The house was quiet when Caleb returned that evening. Just as the rain began tapping against the windows, he dropped his satchel near the coat rack and stretched the tension out of his shoulders. It had been a long day at school, grading final portfolios, comforting a student who had come out in tears after lunch. And now all he wanted was a warm bath and a silent hour with his sketchbook. But something unfamiliar waited for him on the dining table. A square box, deep navy, embossed with gold. Its presence was so out of place in their modest, lived-in apartment that Caleb paused. The table was usually scattered with coffee rings, paint-stained envelopes, and Mateo's design magazines. But this box, glossy, luxurious, meticulously tied with a silk ribbon, looked like it belonged in a showroom. Not here, not in their home. He untied the ribbon with a hesitation he didn't fully understand. Inside, nestled in white tissue, was a wedding invitation. Not the ones they had discussed, not the ones he'd helped design with watercolors and recycled paper. This one was heavy, ornate, engraved in gold. The kind of invitation that came with silent judgments and long guest lists. And it didn't mention the small wooden church in Portland. It read, Caleb and Mateo to be wed in Venice, Italy. His breath caught. He read it again, then again. Venice, he had never even set foot in Europe. His fingers gripped the edges of the box. Somewhere behind him, a cupboard clicked shut. Surprise, baby, Mateo said, stepping into view with a grin. Do you like it? Caleb turned slowly, the invitation still trembling in his hands. His voice refused to come. Mateo crossed the room quickly, placing both hands on Caleb's shoulders like he was grounding him from spiraling. I know. It's a lot, he said, almost laughing. But you deserve more than some dusty wooden pews and paper streamers. I talked to my dad. He offered to cover everything. The flights, the venue, even a private gondola for the vows. Caleb blinked. You talked to your dad? Yes, months ago. Actually, he's thrilled. I wanted it to be a surprise. Mateo smiled again, like this was a proposal within the proposal. I mean, come on, Venice. It's romantic. It's timeless. You'll look amazing against the canals. But Caleb didn't want to be picturesque. He wanted to be heard. He stepped back, the invitation still open in one hand. When were you going to ask me? Mateo tilted his head. Ask you, I'm giving you a dream. No, Caleb said softly. You're giving me your dream, not mine. There was a silence then, one that felt louder than anything said aloud. Mateo, undeterred, tried again. Look, the church was sweet, but come on, we're not kids anymore. That place was, I don't know, it's beneath you now. The word hung in the air like smoke. Beneath you. That church had taken Caleb in when no one else did. It had wrapped its dusty wooden beams around him like arms. It wasn't beneath him. It had lifted him. He placed the box gently on the table and walked toward the bedroom without another word. Mateo called after him, but the sound faded behind the thud of the door. Alone in the quiet, Caleb sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. He didn't feel special. He felt erased. The person Mateo loved, if he ever really did, was being rewritten, refitted, polished into someone who'd look better on a boat in Italy, not someone who once clung to a stranger in a tiny chapel after being kicked out of his family. It wasn't about extravagance. It was about dignity. And what Caleb realized, sitting there in the soft hum of nightfall, was this when people begin planning your life for you without asking. They're not honoring you. They're replacing you. Love isn't about upgrades. It's about listening. And respect, when missing, can't be bought back with gondolas. The next morning, the invitation box still sat untouched on the dining table. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, catching the golden embossing and making it gleam like something precious. But to Caleb, it looked like a trophy for a race he never agreed to run. He didn't pack much, just a duffel with some clothes, his sketchbook, and the framed photo of his grandmother from the mantel. He left his key on the hook by the door and took the stairs instead of the elevator. The silence between floors mirrored the one growing in his chest. His best friend Harper welcomed him without asking questions. She offered the spare room and hot tea. And for that, Caleb was grateful. Her apartment overlooked a small park where kids drew chalk rainbows on the pavement and elderly couples fed birds in slow motion. It felt like a pause between chapters, but not an ending. Mateo texted constantly. Paragraphs poured in apologies wrapped in justifications, promises laced with confusion. He sent voice messages that Caleb didn't open, and pictures of venues in Venice that made Caleb feel like an accessory in someone else's fantasy. He said things like, I just wanted it to be perfect, and this isn't a betrayal, it's a gift. But perfection meant nothing if it erased who Caleb was. Days passed. Caleb stayed quiet, drawing until the pages of his sketchbook curled from overuse. He found himself sketching the little wooden church again and again, never grand, never ornate, but always full of light. The pews, the soft flicker of stained glass, the memory of a man with kind eyes and a steady voice who had once offered shelter when the world didn't. Caleb picked up the phone. It had been years since he'd spoken to Pastor Rhodes. The number still lived in his contacts, untouched but never deleted. The call rang twice before a warm voice answered, low and familiar. Caleb, the man said, not asking, just recognizing. His throat tightened. It's me. He didn't need to explain. The pastor remembered everything, the bruises, the buzz, the way Caleb had clung to his sleeve like a child drowning in shame. They spoke for a while. Caleb talked about his engagement, about the box on the table, about the ache that came with being reshaped without consent. I thought I was building something real, Caleb said, but now it feels like a show. There was a pause on the line. Then the voice came soft but certain. Son, the pastor said, your worth isn't measured by chandeliers or headlines. It never was. You were whole the day you walked into that church, and you're whole now. Don't let anyone decorate over that. Tears came quickly. Caleb pressed the phone to his forehead and let the silence cradle him. That night, he lay awake in Harper's guest room, the ceiling swimming in shadows. His body felt tired, but his mind had never been clearer. He could see the problem for what it was, not the venue, not the extravagance, but the silence. Mateo had made decisions on his behalf, assuming love gave him permission. But love, real love, doesn't silence. It invites. Respect isn't about funding someone's dreams. It's about not rewriting them. Caleb thought of his students, especially the ones still learning how to say I am without flinching. What would he tell them if he stayed silent now? That swallowing your voice was the price of companionship, that love demanded surrender. No, he couldn't be that kind of example. He knew now if he walked into that Venetian spectacle, he wouldn't be entering a marriage. He'd be attending a performance where he was the prop. Some people mistake control for care. They confuse grandeur with meaning. But Caleb had lived long enough without approval to know this truth: quiet love, freely given, holds more power than any ceremony dressed in marble and lace. And silence, when allowed to grow, can become a language of its own. A language that says, you don't matter. But Caleb mattered. And he wasn't going to be able to let anyone, not even someone he loved, tell him otherwise. The cafe was small, tucked between a florist and a used bookstore, the kind of place where quiet people lingered over second cups and the baristas remembered your name. Caleb chose a corner table by the window, the same one he and Mateo used to call their spot back in the first year when they shared stories over chipped mugs and left napkins scattered with ink doodles. He came early. He needed the stillness. Outside, spring rain traced soft lines down the glass. Caleb had dressed simply dark jeans, a charcoal sweater, the rainbow pin his students had gifted him at Pride Week. His hands held the velvet ring box Mateo had given him, now cold in his palm. There was no anger in his chest, just something slower and heavier. Like closing a book you once thought would be your favorite, only to realize the story inside had been overwritten without your permission. Mateo arrived late, as he often did. He looked sharp, as he always did, pressed coat, fresh cologne, a designer scarf looped with practiced ease. When he spotted Caleb, he smiled, relief flickering across his face. He reached out for a kiss Caleb didn't return. I'm glad you called, Mateo said, sliding into the seat across from him. I've missed you. Caleb looked at him for a long time, then placed the ring box on the table between them. This isn't easy, he began, but I need you to hear me before you try to fix anything. Mateo's smile faltered. He nodded slowly. I can't marry you, Caleb said. Silence. I can't start a life with someone who planned an entire future without asking if I wanted it. I can't enter a marriage where my dreams are traded out for your father's credit card. I'm not a set piece for a venue. I'm not a name on an invitation meant to impress investors or guests I've never met. Mateo's voice trembled. It wasn't meant to hurt you. I thought it would make you feel valued." Caleb shook his head. "What I value isn't measured in grandeur. You knew what mattered to me. I told you again and again, and you dismissed it like a phase I'd outgrow. You didn't trust my vision of our life. You replaced it with your own." Mateo leaned back, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. "But we love each other. Do we?" Caleb's voice softened. "Or do you love the version of me that fits your world?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Mateo looked away. Caleb inhaled slowly. "I chose you because I thought we were building something together. But now I realize I was just being fitted into a space someone else designed. Your dad's money, your style, your timing." He stood, sliding the ring box gently toward Mateo. "You said Venice was timeless, but love isn't timeless if it's built on silence." Mateo didn't stop him. He just sat there, staring at the box as if it had become a mirror. As Caleb stepped out into the rain, he felt the ache in his chest shift, not disappear, but settle. He walked without an umbrella, letting the water soak through his sweater, his skin, his doubt. The city hummed around him, unaware, uncaring. But inside, something had settled into place. He wasn't leaving love. He was leaving the illusion of it. It takes courage to say yes to someone, but it takes a deeper kind to say no when that yes costs your voice. Sometimes, people try to love you in the language they know: gifts, gestures, grand promises, but if they never stop to ask what your language is, then all they're really doing is building monuments to themselves. Love, when it's real, doesn't silence you. It listens. And Caleb, for the first time in a long while, was finally listening to himself. The sun filtered softly through the stained glass windows, casting slow-moving hues of amber and violet across the wooden pews. The church smelled like it always had: cedar and age, like time folded into memory. Caleb stood at the front, not in a tuxedo, not under spotlights, but in a linen shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbow. On the lapel of his jacket was a single white lily and a pin in the shape of a small rainbow. 3 months had passed since that final conversation with Mateo, and today wasn't a wedding. It was something else entirely. A quiet crowd gathered: students, former colleagues, Harper, a few of the volunteers from the community art center, and Pastor Rhodes standing near the altar, his hands folded gently in front of him. There were no crystal chandeliers, no curated backdrops, no orchestras playing on cue. Only laughter in the air, the rustling of paper programs, and the smell of baked goods from the potluck table set out back. This was the place Caleb had chosen. Not for show, but for truth. At the heart of the ceremony was the dedication of a new scholarship fund, the Marion Hayes Arts Fellowship, named for his grandmother. It would be awarded each year to LGBTQ+ youth who had been displaced or rejected by their families, kids who had a voice but nowhere safe to use it. Caleb had poured his savings and a portion of his teaching award grant into launching the first round. A few others had quietly donated. Even one of his students' fathers had offered to sponsor a second scholarship next year. At the front of the church, on an easel, was a framed photograph of his grandmother, smiling in her garden, dirt on her hands, joy in her eyes. She had raised him on casseroles and open arms, with little money but unwavering belief. And when she passed, she left him something more valuable than inheritance: permission to dream out loud. That day, Caleb spoke without notes. His voice carried through the sanctuary, not with grandeur, but clarity. He spoke about shame and how it clings to you when the world tells you you're too much or not enough. He spoke about his younger self, curled on the wooden bench in this very church, afraid to believe he could ever be celebrated. He spoke about love, not the kind sold in catalogs or performed on social media, but the kind that stays, that listens, that learns your language. He didn't mention Mateo by name. There was no bitterness to cast, no scandal to expose, because this wasn't about what he'd left behind. It was about what he'd stepped into. When the speeches ended and people gathered near the potluck table, children chased each other through the pews, giggling. One boy tugged on Caleb's sleeve and asked if he could take home a crayon set from the community art basket. Caleb knelt down, handed the set over, and said, "Promise me you'll draw something true." Later, as the sunlight dimmed and the candles flickered gently on the windowsills, Caleb stood alone for a moment beneath the stained glass arch. He closed his eyes. There were no whispers behind his back, no pressure to perform, no costumes to wear, just breath and peace, and the soft hum of a space that had once held him in his darkest hour and now in his brightest. The world often tells us that to be chosen, we must be polished. But sometimes the most sacred thing you can do is choose yourself unpolished, unedited, unapologetic. And that, perhaps, is the beginning of every real love story. If you were in Caleb's shoes, would you walk away too, or stay for the sake of love? Tell us in the comments. Your voice might help someone find theirs. And don't forget to follow Heart Story for more powerful journeys like this, where love begins with truth.